Sorry for the tech delays. So is this view of the slides okay for everyone to see? Is it large enough?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So I do want to introduce myself. My name is Shaquasia Shannon. I'm the naloxone distribution manager at the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I want to thank you all for having me this morning. This afternoon, I apologize. You are actually one of my officially last trainings because I started the new role as a manager and no longer a trainer. So I am very fortunate that it's limited tech issues today, because it's like, why wouldn't it be, being that it's my last training? That's just the universe for you. So this training will cover in regards to overdose response training. So Narcan training, if you've ever done a Narcan training. As well, we will touch on fentanyl test strips and why they're also an important tool that the Department of Health gives out. So in regards to the naloxone training, what we'll talk about briefly is in regards to how New Yorkers are being impacted. I'm acknowledging that our 2022 data is available. However, our 2021 data is what's in the slides. 2022 data has not been released in regards to our slides. Then go into understanding an opioid overdose and why naloxone is such an important tool. And then the steps of responding to an opioid overdose. So the things we need you to do, say, to be able to potentially save someone's life, and how we make naloxone available throughout New York City. So if you've ever seen any of these blue kits, one way or another, they are from the Department of Health. They may be coming from a community-based organization that gives out these same kits, but we'll show you how we're all connected in the work. So I do want to present a content advisory acknowledging when we're talking about in this training can bring up a lot of different emotions for folks, because we acknowledge the far-reaching impacts of our overdose crisis. Unfortunately, the more people that are lose their life due to an overdose means that it's a rippling effect for their families, for their communities, and those same people can be in the room in the training. So I really want people to take care of themselves, acknowledging when we're talking about our overdose crisis, how it's impacting our communities. Conversations of structural racism and racial inequities also come up, and that can be very traumatizing and bring up stigmatizing experiences as well. So I really encourage folks to take care of themselves in this training. At any point, if you need to get water, make sure you're just taking care of yourself, please do so. Your well-being is most important to me. So in this training, I will be talking about opioids. Okay. So it's really important for folks to know exactly what I mean when I mention opioids. So I'm talking about a specific class of pain relievers. So what does that mean when it comes to opioids? This includes opioid analgesics, which most people know as prescription painkillers, but also things such as heroin and fentanyl. And when it comes to fentanyl, and we'll definitely have more discussion about fentanyl in the second part of the training when we're talking about fentanyl test strips, it's just important for folks to remember that it's a highly potent and fast-acting opioid. So what does that mean? It is an opioid that works quickly, and it is strong. And then lastly is naloxone. So many people don't know naloxone by the name naloxone. They know naloxone by the name of Narcan. So Narcan is comes in a blister pack. It is just one formulation of how naloxone is available, but it is the one that's most readily available to most New Yorkers. So Narcan is a brand name for the one-step formulation of naloxone. Naloxone is that generic medication name. And what does that mean? It is a safe medication that reverses the effects of opioids and prevents that overdose from being fatal. So it only works on opioids. It does not work on any other substance, but it's still safe to give if you're unsure what someone may have consumed and they're showing the signs of an opioid overdose. So we'll definitely talk about what those signs are in the training as well. But before getting to that, it's also really important to discuss how stigma drives these inequities that we have in regards to our fatal overdose crisis. And it's also really important how everyone can understand how they can make a difference. And that difference can be made on how we talk about people who use drugs, how we talk about substance use. Unfortunately, in our society, it has been extremely normalized to stigmatize people who use drugs. And is that no one's personal fault that the words that you see on the left side of this table labeled as potentially stigmatizing, you may have, may have used, may currently use, because unfortunately it is normalized. But we know that potentially stigmatizing language and words and phrases can convey judgment, and really do have real life harms for folks. So we just encourage folks to use more compassionate, person-centered language, acknowledging that this is a person or a community member who uses substances. This may be a participant or a client of an organization, and we want them to consider making changes. We acknowledge that language and identity are extremely personal. And we're not saying that folks with lived experience don't sometimes use potentially stigmatizing language to describe their own experience. What we're asking folks to do is really consider how the words we use have the ability to center someone's humanity, really lift people up and push back on stigma. So in regards to how New Yorkers are being impacted by a fatal overdose crisis, we know in 2021, we lost 2,668 people due to a fatal drug overdose. I know, unfortunately, in 2022, based off our released data, there was another year of increase in 2022. We actually lost 3,026 people in 2022 due to a fatal overdose. So once these data slides get updated, by our data teams, we know that we'll see another high bar for the year 2022. So consistent for 2022 as well as in regards to 2021 data, a New Yorker has died. Well, someone died of a drug overdose in New York City every 3 hours. So even with the increase of 2022, that 3-hour window is still the same in regards to our 2022 data. So it's also really important to understand how this is happening in our neighborhoods of residence. So we know that in 2021, there were 14 neighborhoods that actually had a rate of fatal overdose in their neighborhood of residence higher than the New York City average rate for fatal overdoses. So the way this map works, the darker the shade of blue you see, the higher the rate of fatal overdoses are in that neighborhood of residence. Outlined in red are 5 neighborhoods that actually have the top 5 for the year 2021 in regards to fatal overdoses. Those top 5 are also still the top 5 for 2022 data that we've seen. It's just that the rank in regards to top 5 actually has shifted for a few of them, but they are still all in the same top 5 category. So we're seeing that we know for 2021, East Harlem was one of the top 5. Right behind it was Central Harlem, and acknowledging other parts of Manhattan. So acknowledging the parts of Manhattan as a borough who are being heavily impacted by our fatal overdose crisis. But we see some consistencies, even when we're looking just at consistencies and disparities, I will put that. When we're looking at the 5 boroughs as a whole, and when we're looking at neighborhoods that have higher rates of fatal overdoses, this clearly is a citywide crisis. Every part of New York City is a shade of blue on this map because there was no neighborhood of residents that did not have a fatal overdose among their residents. However, we see that not every shade of blue is the same in this map, and neighborhoods that are experiencing high poverty levels had higher rates of fatal overdoses. And also, unfortunately, we see disparities in regards to our ethnic and racial groups in New York City. So we know that Black New Yorkers had the highest rates of fatal overdoses in 2021 as well as in 2022. We know that as well, Latino and Latina New Yorkers, as well as white New Yorkers had increases in 2022. So it's really important to acknowledge that even though we are, as the Department of Health, give out naloxone, fentanyl test strips, and provide other services, it's really important for people to understand that how the historical lack of resources in these communities, the disparities in how our drug laws have been enforced over decades, have real life health impacts for our communities. So when it comes to understanding how we use data to really push our initiatives to make sure where resources and supplies need to go, we know that the Bronx had the largest rates and the highest number of fatal overdoses. And the reason why I'm still showing this slide, even though I know all of you are residents of Manhattan, if we only focused on rate, we would be missing a large amount of the fatal overdoses that are happening in our communities. So rate is just a way that we can get a sense of general risk for members to experience potentially a fatal overdose. When it comes to, and that graph is what you see on the right side of the screen, is looking at the same thing we saw on the map. It's just that it's breaking it down by the 5 boroughs this time. But when we're looking at the graph on the left side of the screen, which is number of drug overdose deaths, number is just a tally or a count. The way that we get rate is we take that tally or count, that number, in proportion to the population size. So when we look at the rate, we would see high rates of fatal overdoses in Bronx and Staten Island, which is correct, acknowledging that those were our 2 highest neighborhoods and boroughs of residents with rates of fatal overdoses. But I'm not sitting in the Bronx or Staten Island at the moment. I'm in Manhattan. And the reason why is because when we look at number, we know that 447 people lost their life due to a fatal overdose in 2021 that were residents of Manhattan. That actually puts Manhattan 3rd in regards to the number of people lost to a drug overdose. And again, in 2021 and again in 2022, we know East Harlem is one of the top 5 neighborhoods. So there's definitely a need for resources in Manhattan for folks who use substances, as well as resources for those who care about people who use drugs. So when it comes to more specifically to what substances were involved, we know fentanyl was the most common involved substance in our fatal overdoses. In general, opioids are very common in fatal overdoses. So in 2021, we know that an opioid of any sort, so heroin, fentanyl, Percocet, Vicodin, and those prescription painkillers we include in any opioid category, just a larger category for opioids, 84% of fatal overdoses. Unfortunately, we know if someone has died to a fatal overdose and opioids are involved, that was a preventable death. Because we have a safe medication that can reverse the effects of opioids, if someone is there to respond, if someone was there to give Narcan or naloxone, the numbers may have been different. Lives could have been saved. So fentanyl, as a specific group of opioids, was involved in 4 out of 5 fatal overdoses in 2021. In 2022, data is increased to 81%. Cocaine or crack, which is not an opioid, was involved in 47% of fatal overdoses, heroin in 37%, benzodiazepines or benzo, so these are substances such as Klonopin or Ativan, in 17% of fatal overdoses, xylazine, which is a veterinary sedative, was involved in 16%. Opioid analgesics, so think prescription painkillers like Vicodin, Percocet, Oxycontin, those were involved in 15% of fatal overdoses, and methadone in 13% of fatal overdoses. So it's really important to point out cocaine or crack, benzodiazepines, xylazines are not opioids. Naloxone will not have any effect on them. But acknowledging that the vast majority of fatal overdoses included an opioid, we still encourage people to give naloxone if they are unsure what someone has consumed and they're showing the signs of an opioid overdose. This slide is also really important because if someone has unfortunately died due to a fatal overdose, more than likely there are multiple substances involved. So polydrug use, mixing of drugs can increase someone's risk of an overdose. So later on in this training, we'll talk about some risk factors for folks experiencing an overdose and potentially things that they can do to lower that risk. So I am going to pause to see if any questions have come in regards to anything I presented so far.
Eric, I'll let you monitor that, but I have actually one for you,
Sure.
Shwaisha. I'm sure you may go into this later, but when it comes to the timing of when you administer something like naloxone, does that make I assume that would make a difference in terms of its effectiveness on somebody who's experiencing an overdose?
Yeah, so it's always the sooner the better. The reality is if you see someone with those signs, and I'll talk a little bit more about the process of an overdose because it's not as immediate as many people believe it is. It's very rare for it to be immediate. But also there's timing involved in regards to how you administer these doses as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So like any medical emergency, which an opioid overdose is, time is always of importance to make sure that someone can get the support that they need essentially with an opioid overdose to make sure that person can start breathing again as soon as possible.
And then I guess I have one more question about just the geographic information that you provided. Of course, we care about Manhattan, but it's I would like to think that most of us care about the entire city, and it's hard to ignore the huge difference in data that you're providing about the Bronx versus all the other boroughs in there. And so I'm wondering, you touched on some of like the racial and ethnic background differences or differences in poverty level or things like that. But are there other kind of factors that the DOHMH sees as play as to why there's I think it was like 119 versus 56 like rate numbers or something like that between East Harlem and the Bronx? What do you what's going on there?
So specifically between
maybe in Mott Haven.
So it's kind of hard to answer that question because I'm not as keened into the data, but I'll go back really quickly because even though there is some differences, please let me go back. Let me see.
If not, we can wait till the end, I suppose, but
yeah, no, but also acknowledging is like Mott Haven and East New York, even though they're different boroughs, they're both still in the top 5.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to that, when you're looking at rate, it's also looking at the population size. So population can play a role in how those numbers are calculated. Acknowledging that even though like our graph only shows early as 2000s, I believe, 2010s, the reality is communities in East Harlem and the South Bronx have been dealing with overdoses for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So we're having, and it's important to have these conversations. However, these communities have been burdened with the rates of fatal overdoses in their communities for decades. Programs have been fighting to do this work, even before the Department of Health has been doing this work at this level. So it's acknowledging that we give out naloxone, but it's a lot of harm reduction programs, syringe service programs that do a lot of the groundwork that made it possible for decades later for naloxone to be so much more readily available, to the point now that it is over the counter as of this year, where it doesn't require prescription. So there's a lot of changes there. So I can't really speak to the finites of the data of anything of what kind of these disparities, but even then the differences I wouldn't say are to a point where one thing might be happening in a community and then it's not happening in another. It might just be the scale of which is happening or the size of the population. Because when we're talking about the top 5, the numbers are still pretty close to each other. So cool. So go into understanding an opioid overdose. So this kind of does start to get to some of what you asked earlier. But it's good to understand how opioids work, so you have a better understanding of how naloxone works. So we'll talk about how opioids work in the body and that process of an opioid overdose. So everyone's body has opioid receptors in their brain, and they're being represented by these gray squiggly lines. Opioids being represented by purple circles, when they are consumed, bind to opioid receptors in our brain, and they can relieve pain, they can relieve withdrawal symptoms. So if someone has been using opioids for some time, taking more opioids when they're having withdrawal can help them feel better. It also can produce feelings of mental and physical wellness or comfort, but there are side effects to opioid use, such as constipation, nausea, drowsiness, and respiratory depression. Respiratory depression is just another way to say slowed breathing. So when it comes to slowed breathing, that is the process that person who's experiencing an overdose is going through to a dangerous level. So as I mentioned earlier, it is rare for someone to die immediately from an overdose. So when someone survived, it was because there was someone there to intervene and respond. The process of an overdose can take minutes to hours to occur. So it starts off with a amount of a opioid, a strength of an opioid, or even opioids mixed with other substances that cause that person's involuntary drive to breathe to slow down to a dangerous point. And as that happens, and that happens longer, that impacts other vital organs like the brain and the heart, and they slow down due to the lack of oxygen. And that can also lead to the heart potentially stopping, leading to a fatal overdose, or putting that person closer to a fatal overdose. So no matter if you're coming across someone with signs that are more towards the end, the beginning of this process or the end of this process, we still encourage that you follow the steps of giving naloxone, because there still is the potential to save someone's life. So when it comes to understanding naloxone, its only function is to reverse the effects of opioid overdoses. It has no effect, zero effect, if opioids are not present in someone's system. And it does come in different formulations as nasal spray as well as intramuscular injection. So most of the naloxone that is available in New York City through Department of Health, as well as other programs that opioid overdose prevention programs, which are community-based programs that receive their naloxone from us, they give out Narcan, the nasal spray formulation. There's no known negative effects of giving someone naloxone. However, if someone is opioid dependent or have been using opioids for some time, it can put them into withdrawal. And withdrawal is not comfortable. Many people may have known withdrawal back in the day as dope sick. It is not pleasant for someone to be in that state. But if we do not give someone who is having an opioid overdose naloxone, the side effect that we want to avoid is that person's death. So it's really important that when the steps we go over on recognizing and then checking to see if naloxone is necessary to be given are followed. There's no way for someone to misuse or become dependent on naloxone, as well as responders have liability protection in New York State for carrying and using their kits in good faith. So, go ahead.
When you pause, I will ask a question.
Okay, no problem. So how does naloxone work in itself? So when it comes to naloxone, we see this image where we see the opioids are binding to those receptors. We're giving them Narcan, and now naloxone is binding to those receptors where the opioids were before. So it does take about 2 to 8 minutes for naloxone to start working. It takes naloxone about 2 minutes to restore someone's breathing. Naloxone will be in their system for 30 to 90 minutes. So for 30 to 90 minutes, that person may not feel the effects of their drug. But as you see in the image, when we ran the animation, naloxone did not remove the opioids from that person's system. It just made sure that the opioids can't bind to the receptors so that they can breathe. The person's body will have to get rid of the opioids at its normal rate. So just need you to remember that naloxone takes about 2 minutes to start working. So questions before going deeper into the signs?
Responders, is that literally like first responders, or are you saying that anyone who's been through training and has the kit is considered a responder? Any old? Okay.
Yes. So anyone who's received the training has gone through the kit, and that's because of the way the public health law is set up to make it the mechanisms to make this available in the ways that it does.
Great.
So responding to an opioid overdose. These are the 5 common signs we need you to be able to recognize. So remember how I said respiratory depression is just slowed breathing? That could be a sign of someone having an opioid overdose. Their breathing has slowed or stopped completely. Someone who is overdosing will be unconscious or unresponsive. Additionally, another sign could be that a person's lips or nails may turn blue, gray, or white. So we give 3 color variations because people of a deeper complexion, their lips or nails may not turn blue. It may come across more as a gray or a white. So we want people to be aware of that. Someone going through an overdose may give off a deep snoring or gurgling sound. So don't assume someone snoring is someone safely sleeping, because that could be the sign of an opioid overdose as their body is trying to get air. And in fentanyl-involved overdoses, this is an atypical sign, but it does appear at times. a muscle stiffness or rigidity. So someone's arms or limbs can be stiff, their chest will be stiff, their jaw could be locked in this muscle stiffness. However, their eyes could also be open or closed. But even if their eyes are open, they still aren't able to respond to individuals. So it's really important for folks to know if you see any one of these signs, it is possible that someone is going through an opioid overdose, and we want you to follow the steps of responding. So one of the 5 signs, more than one of the 5 signs, the next thing you should do is check for responsiveness. Because as I mentioned before, someone overdosing will not be able to respond to you. So shout at them, hey, are you okay? If you know their name, use their name. Hey, if you don't wake up, I'm gonna have to call 911 to get you some medical help. Can you respond to me? But if someone does not respond to that shouting, the next thing we want you to do is the sternal rub. And this is the most consistent way to check to see if someone is responsive by basically you're making a fist, and with the knuckles of your fist, you're grinding your knuckles into that person's breastbone or sternum for about 5 to 10 seconds, and you're grinding with pressure. So you are going to cause them some pain. However, you are not harming them in any way. And the way that you do that is also in the slide is an image of someone providing the sternal rub. So if you do the sternal rub to yourself right now, you may notice that pain and discomfort happens. So with pressure for 5 to 10 seconds. If someone is unresponsive, they are not responding to that pain you're giving them. Someone who's responsive can respond to that discomfort, that pain you're causing them. We always want you to do the sternal rub before giving naloxone, because this is how we're checking to make sure giving them naloxone was necessary in that situation. But sometimes it can be challenging to tell if someone is just under the influence of their substance or actually experiencing an overdose. So if someone responds to the shouting you did, they respond to the sternal rub, even if their response is verbal, try to keep them alert and monitor them closely. Giving them naloxone in that very moment is not needed, but an overdose could still be possible. So keep the naloxone, keep the Narcan nearby, and stay with them and ensure they won't be left alone. However, we always encourage folks, when in doubt, call 911 for medical help. So when calling 911, so especially if the sternal rub is performed and you do not get a response from that person, you want to get medical help by telling the dispatcher the exact address and specific location of the person in need of help and assistance. You just need to tell them the signs that you see. The person is not breathing, they're turning blue, they're non-responsive, whatever those signs are. And we encourage folks to call 911 because it may not be an overdose. The 5 common signs could be another medical emergency that's happening. It is still safe to give someone naloxone, even if it's not an opioid overdose. Other medical complications may have started depending how long they've been in that process of an overdose, as well as you may need more doses of naloxone needed. So for those who are in person, you can get a naloxone kit, that blue kit, and it will come with 2 doses. However, and additionally, if you request a naloxone kit to be mailed to you, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, it also comes with 2 doses. It is possible for someone to need more than 2 doses of naloxone to reverse that overdose. And guess who has that with them when they come? EMTs. So we do encourage folks to call 911, and we also live in the reality that we know this can be a really challenging call for many people. So our public safety partners, our public health professionals, as myself, really push for the necessity of calling for 911 in medical emergencies. And at the same time, we believe we live in the reality that everyone doesn't feel comfortable calling 911. So New York State has a 911 Good Samaritan law. That this law provides some protections in regards to prosecution for the person experiencing the overdose and the person who has called if there's some other things on scene that can be playing out, such as drugs up to an A2 felony offense. For those who may be underage drinking, alcohol is included, cannabis of any amount, paraphernalia offenses, as a way of sharing of drugs. This law is not perfect, but is what we have available to us in New York State. It does not provide explicit legal protections for parole or probation violations, open warrants, or other illegal matters around immigration or child welfare. But we do want the public to know that this law is available to them when we train them. So when it comes to how to actually administer naloxone itself, so when it comes to Narcan itself, it comes in a blister pack. So the first step we want folks to do is peel. So peel, the blister pack is in the top right corner of the peel tab is the top right corner of the blister pack. Right now, I have a test device in my hand, index and middle finger on the side, on the top of the device, around the nozzle portion, and your thumb on the side. Narcan devices can only be used one time. So we don't want to push the plunger or put our thumb on the plunger until we do the second step of place the nozzle into the person's nostrils, to the tips of your nostrils, touch their fingers on the device. And then what you want to do is use your thumb to press the plunger. So on the test device, you'd see that the plunger re-releases. It's a red plunger that's on video. This plunger does not re-release on live Narcan devices. So please do not test the device. Do not put your thumb on the plunger or press the plunger until it's in the person's nostrils. And then step 4 can be really difficult to do when someone may not be breathing in front of you. Step 4 is asking you to wait 2 minutes and see if you need to give another dose. If you wait 2 minutes and that person is not breathing after waiting 2 minutes after that first dose was given, then we want you to repeat peel, place, and press with the second dose. Ideally, the second dose goes in the opposite nostril from the first dose. If you don't remember, that is okay. If someone is not breathing after 2 minutes after giving that first dose, give the second dose in whichever nostril you remember. And if you did not call 911 before, we encourage you to call 911 at that point. So before continuing on to the last few steps of responding to an overdose, I want to see if there's any questions about the signs of an overdose, how to administer naloxone, how to check for responsiveness.
Once again, you should be putting your questions in the Q&A function on the screen, at the bottom of your screen. I have just one question for you as a follow-up. So if somebody's not breathing, I guess I feel like I have been in previous trainings where you should be going into like CPR, but what comes first? Like naloxone, then CPR, naloxone, then you're waiting until.
So it depends. So CPR is always encouraging folks to do their CPR train anytime someone isn't breathing.
Okay.
But what happens is we can't predict every scenario, what resources, who's going to be available in overdose. So sometimes you may have multiple people available to respond. Sometimes you only have yourself. So if you're only by yourself, have to do the best to figure out what's the best thing to do first. If Narcan is with you or is it in another room? If you have multiple people there, someone could be doing CPR while somebody else is getting the Narcan. So it's not necessarily which one is best to do first. These are all the things that can be done, and do the best that you can. Also in emergency situations, things tend to happen simultaneously. So it's like I've in situations was on the phone and had to open the Narcan kit at the same time or direct someone as I'm getting the Narcan kit. So it's not a matter of which one is necessary first. It's just as a responder, try to do your best to follow these steps. So I'll definitely talk a little bit more about rescue breathing for those who are not CPR trained as another way to support someone with an opioid overdose.
Thank you.
The 5 were blue, gray, white,
Lips and nails.
unresponsive, lips and nails.
Yep.
Unresponsive,
Yep.
not breathing. What were the other 2?
So a deep snoring or gurgling sound, and for fentanyl-involved overdoses of muscle stiffness.
Right.
So it could be one of those signs or all those signs. So it's just, we don't want people to think that it has to be more than one to check for responsiveness. If you see even one, follow the steps of at least checking for responsiveness next. So when it comes to what can happen after someone becomes responsive after being given naloxone, folks can feel a number of different emotions. As humans, we are very complex. And that complexity doesn't stop in emergency situations. So when someone becomes responsive after giving them naloxone, they can be feeling a number of different emotions, but the most common emotions, the most way that they're feeling is confused and afraid. They don't know what's happening. They don't know what's going on. So as a responder, try your best to be as calm as possible in a scary situation, because responding to an overdose, experiencing overdose is scary. Try to show that person as much compassion as you can in that moment as well. Explain to them that you tried to wake them up. They weren't waking up. You gave them naloxone, and ask them, are they okay? Because they may not be feeling well, also because they may have started to go through withdrawal. Reassure them that the naloxone wears off in 30 to 90 minutes. So while the naloxone is in their system, it is unlikely for them to reduce their withdrawal by taking more drugs during that time. It may actually increase their risk of another overdose. So we always also want responders to encourage that person to not use any more drugs for that 30 to 90-minute window. So we're not saying don't use any more drugs at all. That could be a conversation for a later date if that person is open to it. What we're asking is that that person not use any substance for 30 to 90 minutes, just to make sure that they're okay out of this overdose situation. If someone, responders, definitely you should discuss with someone in regards to receiving follow-up medical care. But if someone declines medical attention, see if someone can stay with them for at least 3 hours. So just to make sure that they're okay. So to get to the question about CPR, if you are CPR trained, we encourage you to do CPR anytime someone isn't breathing. Follow your CPR training. However, for those who are not CPR trained, we encourage you to do rescue breaths for opioid overdoses. Inside our kits, there's also a white packet. And when it is torn open, it gives access to a face shield. So there is a filter piece around the mouth region of that face shield. There's language at the bottom that says CPR face shield or mouth-to-mouth face shield. Long as you can read that language left to right, that is the side that faces you as a responder, as a person giving the breath. So as you see, the steps are on the slide, but I'm also just going to quickly demonstrate it. You want to place that person, or talk it out, place that person on their back, tilt their chin up. You want to look into their mouth when you open it to see if there's any objects there. If you see something and you can safely remove it, remove it. You see nothing, assume nothing is there. Then what you do is then place the face shield, making sure the filter piece is over their open mouth. And this will be between you and that individual. Then you pinch their nose closed and provide 2 normal sized breaths, and then 1 breath every 5 seconds. So essentially through CPR or rescue breathing, you are making sure that oxygen can stay circulating in that person's body. And one of the other additional things that you can do to support someone when they're experiencing an overdose is to put the person in the recovery position. And there's an image of that in this slide. So the recovery position is just a supported side position that keeps that person's airways open and prevents that person from choking. Anytime you are not with the person who's overdosing, so if you have to leave them alone for whatever amount of time, when you are not actively doing the steps of administering Narcan or naloxone, and you are not doing rescue breathing or CPR for those who are CPR trained, the safest position for that person is this position, the recovery position. So how do you get access to naloxone? So it's really important that folks know how to get access to naloxone. So if you're here with me in person, I have naloxone kits available, but also additionally, we do mail naloxone within the 5 boroughs of New York City. So you can click on, you can use your phone to access through the QR code. So if you have a smartphone, open the camera and point it to the screen, that box that you see of that design will take you to our webpage for Next District, host our request form. So you would just be providing your mailing information on that request form, and you will receive a naloxone kit for about, it takes up to 10 business days to make it to you in the mail. However, if you cannot wait up to 10 business days, which is completely understandable, to receive naloxone, there are over 300 programs in New York City called opioid overdose prevention programs, and many of the CBOs that are part of these programs do give out naloxone to the public, and that list is on our webpage as well. So nyc.gov/naloxone is our webpage. It has a list of where you can access these same blue kits at no charge. There is also a small list of select pharmacies, part of a pilot program that we did, that we started up during the height of the COVID pandemic, to make sure that we can increase access to these free naloxone kits when we knew that programs were trying to navigate closures because of the guidance. So that is still available. Additionally, you can purchase naloxone or Narcan out of pocket through insurance or and now with over the counter. So there's also a list of pharmacies on our webpage as well, where you can purchase naloxone without needing a prescription, which is separate from the over-the-counter that just started in the last few months. So those are some other ways to get access to naloxone. If you get one of the kits from us directly or one of our community-based organizations, what comes in that kit is 2 doses of Narcan, a face shield, non-latex gloves, educational materials, as well as a blue certificate of completion. So that is just saying that you've been trained to respond to that opioid overdose. And if you receive a kit from us, that blue card will be in there. You want to put your name and the date on that blue card and put it back in your kit. And inside every kit, we give instructions on how to respond to an overdose. So we know that when we're going through this training, this might be a lot of information for someone at one time. And it's like, what do I do? How do I refresh myself? Inside the kit, there's instructions in English and in Spanish on the other side. And it's inside the kit when you receive the kit. So we always encourage folks to review that insert as well. So if you ever use your naloxone kit, on the back of that blue card, which is the size of a business card in the kit, we'll have our email address. So reach out to us if you ever want to do an anonymous report of responding to an overdose. But also it's really important for you to get a refill on your kit. So naloxone's expiration date is on the back of the blister pack, and expired naloxone could be a reason to reach out to us to get an up-to-date naloxone kit. If your kit is lost, stolen, or damaged, or if you use even one of the doses at any point, a full kit is 2 doses, reach out to us. It's really important for folks to know that sometimes when we have naloxone, we carry around our kits, we forget to check the expiration dates. Human nature, we get busy. But then we realize when we need to use it, when someone unfortunately may be showing the signs of an opioid overdose. In those situations, if all you have is expired naloxone, use the expired naloxone and call 911. Expired naloxone is better than no naloxone at all in an overdose. Expired naloxone does not cause anyone any harm by giving it to them. It's just that they can't guarantee the strength of it as they can before the expiration date. So in summary, just making sure that you know that naloxone is a safe medication. It reverses effects of opioid overdoses. Look for any sign of an opioid overdose. So one of those 5 signs, if you see them, we want you to check for responsiveness by first shouting at the person and then doing the sternal rub if they don't respond to the shouting. If they don't respond to the sternal rub, remember to give them naloxone and provide additional support, which could be getting medical help, doing rescue breathing or CPR for those who are trained in CPR, and putting that person in the recovery position when necessary, when it's applicable. And always remember, you can report your use and get a refill on your naloxone kit. So I'm not sure if this is going to play. Let's see. Because sometimes we get questions about how.
Drug overdose is a leading cause of death in New York City.
Can y'all
It
hear
kills
that?
more New Yorkers each year than homicide, suicide, and motor vehicle crashes.
Yes, we can.
Opioids are involved in most overdose deaths. Opioids include heroin, prescription painkillers, and fentanyl. Fentanyl is a fast-acting and highly potent opioid that is being found in heroin, cocaine, crack, counterfeit pills, and other drugs sold on the street and online. An opioid overdose happens when someone takes more or stronger opioids than their body can manage, causing their breathing to slow down or even stop. Naloxone, also known as Narcan, the brand name for naloxone nasal spray, is a safe medication that can temporarily reverse the effects of an opioid overdose. Some signs of a possible opioid overdose include unresponsiveness, slower or stopped breathing, lips or fingernails turning blue, gray, or white depending on skin tone, snoring or gurgling sounds. In some cases, people may become rigid or stiff. If any of these symptoms are present, it's important to respond quickly. If you're worried someone might be overdosing, first check for responsiveness. Shout in the person's ear. If the person does not respond, do a sternal rub by making a fist and rubbing your knuckles hard on the person's sternum or breastbone for about 5 to 10 seconds. If the person responds to the sternal rub, which could include speaking or moving, continue to monitor them and keep naloxone on hand in case they become unresponsive. The person should not be left alone. If a pulse oximeter is available, it can be used to monitor their oxygen levels if they appear sedated. If they don't respond, it's an emergency. Call 911 or alert a medical professional if there is one on site. It's important to have medical help on the way. There may be complications, or the person might be having a different kind of medical emergency. When calling 911, give the dispatcher a specific location and tell them you are with someone who is unresponsive and not breathing. With some exceptions, the New York State 911 Good Samaritan law provides protection to a person calling 911 to save a life and to the person who is overdosing, even if drugs are present. As soon as possible, give naloxone. This video provides instruction for the single-step nasal spray called Narcan. Peel back the package to remove the device. Place the nozzle in either nostril until your fingers touch the bottom of the person's nose. Press the plunger firmly to release the entire dose into the person's nose. It's important not to press the plunger until the nozzle is in the person's nose. Each device can only be used once. After giving naloxone, monitor the person for 2 minutes, and if the person isn't breathing, give rescue breaths while waiting for the person to respond. If the person is not responsive after 2 minutes, give a second dose of naloxone. You can perform rescue breathing or CPR if you know how. To perform rescue breathing, place the person onto their back, tilt their head back, and open their mouth. You can place the face shield included in your kit over their nose and mouth. Then, pinch the person's nose closed. Make a seal between your mouth and theirs and give 2 regular breaths into the mouth. Ensure that their chest is rising and readjust the person if necessary. Continue with 1 breath every 5 seconds. Getting oxygen to an overdosing person might reduce serious complications and can keep a person alive until help arrives. When not giving naloxone or rescue breaths, put the person on their side to prevent choking. This is called the recovery position. This is particularly important if you have to leave the person alone. Hopefully, after 1 or 2 doses of Narcan, the person will respond. If this happens, calmly explain that they were overdosing and you gave them naloxone. Naloxone works for 30 to 90 minutes. Explain to the person who overdosed that they may experience opioid withdrawal symptoms until the naloxone wears off, and that using more drugs is unlikely to relieve withdrawal, but could increase risk for another overdose. Medical attention after an overdose is important, but if the person doesn't choose to get medical help, they should not be left alone for several hours, since another overdose is possible when the naloxone wears off. To review, if you see someone who you think might be overdosing, first, check for responsiveness. Shout at them and do the sternal rub. If they don't respond, call 911 so that medical help is on the way. Give Narcan. If the person doesn't respond within 2 minutes, give a second dose. Remember, it's also important to give rescue breaths and put the person in the recovery position. If you use drugs, follow these safety tips to reduce risk of overdose. Test your drugs using fentanyl test strips. If positive, consider not using. If you do plan to use, start with a small dose and go slowly. Avoid using alone and take turns. Avoid mixing drugs. Keep naloxone ready and on hand. You can review overdose response steps, learn about overdose prevention, find naloxone, or submit an anonymous report if you use your naloxone by downloading the Stop OD NYC app, available in both the iPhone and Android app stores. By following the response steps outlined in this video, you can save a life.
So go back. So that was just a nice quick review. Does anyone have any questions about naloxone, Narcan, and how to respond to an opioid overdose?
There are no current questions in the Q&A. However, if anybody does have a question, please put your question in the Q&A.
I think that we're gonna move on. If no questions are on right now, that's fine. But I want to just say, so I think we're gonna move on to talk about fentanyl test strips.
Yeah.
Just keeping in mind the time, this is gonna go a little over one o'clock. So if you have to leave, we understand. If you want to stay on to learn about the fentanyl test strips piece, that's what's gonna be covered next. Again, I just want to remind everybody that we are recording this entire thing. We'll be putting it on the BP's YouTube page afterwards, and we'll be sending it out to anybody who either attended or registered for these trainings. So with that, I wanted to say thank you again. If you have to leave us, we understand. If you can stay, we'd love for you to stay to take the second portion, which is going to go over fentanyl test strips and all about that.
Yes.
So go ahead, Quasia.
So before again, it's really good to go over briefly some overdose risk factors and safety tips, because it helped make sense in regards to the fentanyl test strip portion to training. So we know that there are some common risk factors for someone experiencing an opioid overdose. So acknowledging changes in tolerance is one of them. So if someone unfortunately has taken a break in their drug use, they may not realize that their tolerance has lowered to that substance because of that break. And there are specific, I'll go back. Someone may stop using their drug or take a break in their drug use for a number of different reasons. Just as unique as that person could be a number of reasons why someone has stopped taking their substance. But we know that there are certain shared experiences in our communities, such as folks who may just been recently released from incarceration, or they just may have finished a treatment program, a rehab program, or a detox program, where those breaks were created, and they are at increased risk of experiencing an overdose if they use after that break. Mixing of drugs, as I mentioned before, can increase someone's risk of an overdose, because mixing of drugs can just create more stress on the body as the body processes it out. But we also know that mixing of certain drugs, which we label central nervous system depressants, but these are all substances that slow someone's breathing down. So when they're mixed together, they can increase someone's risk of slow breathing, increase their risk of an overdose. So substances that are central nervous system depressants are opioids. Remember how I said opioids can slow down breathing, but also such as alcohol and benzodiazepines. These are also other central nervous system depressants and are also commonly found involved in opioid overdoses. Drug quality, buying drugs off the street or online is not the same as buying drugs from our regulated pharmaceutical drug market. And someone is consuming drugs from our unregulated market, an illicit drug, there's no way to confirm what that person is receiving is exactly what they were looking for, the potency or the strength of that substance as well. And our unregulated drug market is unpredictable to changes in strength, purity, or quality. So that is more of a universal risk factor that folks who use substances that are obtained from non-pharmaceutical, non-clinical sources have. We know that previous non-fatal overdose and experiencing one is a risk factor for experiencing another overdose. So what do I mean by previous non-fatal overdose? So that is when someone has experienced an overdose before and they survived. But unfortunately, research and data shows us that this person now is at an increased risk of experiencing another overdose. And research and data shows this has a lot to do with how challenging it can be for someone to make changes in their drug use. Did they have the time and resources available to kind of figure out what risk factors may have been in play in that initial overdose, as well as did they have any resources and support that they needed to make the changes or sustain the changes that they've made available to them? Using alone is not a risk factor for someone experiencing an overdose, but is a risk factor for someone dying of an overdose. Because remember when we went over those signs of someone experiencing an overdose, someone will be unresponsive experiencing an overdose, which means they cannot respond to their own overdose. Someone has to be there to make sure that they can call 911, to give Narcan, to just be there to help respond to that overdose. Someone cannot do that for themselves. So use of any opioids can put someone at risk of an overdose, but there are things that folks can do to lower that risk of an overdose. So these are things that we already heard part of in the video that I just showed you, just summarizing the naloxone overdose response with the naloxone. Sorry about that. And these are things that folks can do to reduce their risk of an overdose. So when possible, we encourage folks to, if they have taken a break or missed a dose, use less, go slow, do a slow shot. You can always do more later. You can't do less later. We want folks to think about what an overdose response plan can look like. And do we have a phone on hand to call 911 if an emergency does come up? We encourage people, if or when possible, to buy from people they trust and ask about the changes in the product. Talk with others about the current drug quality to get a sense potentially. We also additionally encourage, if or when possible, for folks to not use alone and also not at the same time. So we want folks and encourage them to use and take turns while they're using to ensure that someone is still there to respond at any point. But some folks may still decide to use alone in a physical sense. So creating a system where that person can get help is also extremely important if an emergency happens. And one way folks do that is the Never Use Alone hotline. So on this hotline, the number is on the screen. Someone can call and the volunteers on this hotline will take the person's information in regards to their location and stay on the phone with them. So if at any point they become unresponsive, that person is able to call 911 to get medical help to the person, even though they decided to use alone in a physical space. And if or when ready, we encourage folks to talk to their healthcare providers when it comes to making changes to their opioid use, medication for opioid use disorder. So these are substances such as methadone and buprenorphine. Many people may know buprenorphine as Suboxone. It is a gold standard in treating someone with an opioid use disorder to have medications for opioid use disorder. So it's really making sure that folks are having the necessary conversations, getting access to the full spectrum of treatment they have available to them, because these medications can help with the cravings as well as the withdrawal symptoms they will experience as they make changes to their opioid use. And the reason why I wanted to talk about how lowering risk to experiencing an overdose before getting into the fentanyl test strip training is because fentanyl test strips and utilizing them is a way to lower the risk of someone experiencing an overdose, because it helps them get a sense of what may be in their drug product. So are there any questions about the common risk factors that I just went over, as well as acknowledging other forms of risk reduction include people utilizing our overdose prevention centers, which both of them are in Manhattan and East Harlem, as well as Washington Heights, where people are supervised while someone uses substances. So if someone needs to intervene or that person goes into medical emergency, there are professionals there to help. So I'm not seeing any questions come in, so I'm gonna continue on just for the sake of time. Uh-oh. That shouldn't happen. Sorry about that. Where's the cursor? There we go. So when it comes to fentanyl test strip training, I want to make sure that folks understand what fentanyl is, what fentanyl harm reduction and overdose prevention looks like, specifically around these test strips, and then go into details on how to actually use them, because it's really important that folks know how to use them to get the most accurate reading so that they can make the best choices on how they're going to use their substances if they choose to use their substances at that time. So what is fentanyl? So I did a brief description of it. It's a strong opioid that works quickly. So just so that folks know that it is a synthetic, short-acting opioid that is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, 30 to 50 times stronger than heroin. So when there is pharmaceutical fentanyl that exists, and when it's prescribed for severe pain, or it could have been a part of someone's anesthesia cocktail from other people's experiences, that is a regulated fentanyl product. When we're talking about what is in our drug supply driving our overdose crisis, it is a non-pharmaceutical fentanyl product that is illegally made, it's illicitly made, and it tends to come in a powdered form. So it can be added to other drugs. And so it's really important for folks to know, even if they may not necessarily be looking for an opioid, they may be looking for another substance. We know that we have found fentanyl in opioid and non-opioid substances in New York City. So also understanding that the mixing of fentanyl in the drug supply and a drug product can be inconsistent. So it's really unevenly mixed. There's no way to really predict how much or how strong of the opioid is in there. And there are other analogs or different kinds of fentanyl, or another way, different variants of fentanyl that can be present. Some of them are stronger than others. It may pose a higher risk of an overdose for the stronger ones, especially. So we know New Yorkers who use drugs are more likely to encounter fentanyl in their drug product than previous years. In late 2020, more than 80% of heroin tested at New York City Police Department labs included fentanyl. So they were found in substances, as I mentioned before, cocaine or crack, ketamine, methamphetamine, or benzodiazepines, and overdose pain relievers from non-pharmaceutical sources. So basically street pills or counterfeit pills. So when it comes to fentanyl harm reduction and overdose prevention, it's really important for people to understand why. And sometimes folks have a question, why do people intentionally use fentanyl? Acknowledging that people use drugs for a number of different reasons, and recreational purposes do include fentanyl use. Acknowledging that some people may use fentanyl to avoid positive drug tests, so fentanyl may not show up in a routine 5-panel drug test. It provides a stronger high or euphoria. It is especially true for people who have used opioids for a long time and have a higher drug tolerance. So acknowledging that tolerance is how our body adapts to regular use of drugs over time. Someone has been using drugs for some time, may continue to use opioids, not necessarily just to feel the effects of the drug, but to also to not feel sick. So fentanyl allows them to experience at times that feeling of euphoria, that high that they may not have had for a very long time. Depending on when someone has started using drugs, especially if they started using drugs since like 2015, 2016, they may be more familiar with fentanyl in their drugs because that's what we know that's when fentanyl became more apparent in our drug supply in New York City. Fentanyl can be more cost effective. So we know that some parts of that is because it can be cheaper to produce, but also acknowledging that fentanyl does provide benefits in regards to pain management. So there's a variety of reasons why someone may intentionally use fentanyl, but it's really important that we also address some of the myths that are being spread or being shared around fentanyl. And we know that people aren't sharing these to cause harm to people. People are sharing them because they want to keep their community safe. But one thing that we know for sure, in order to keep a community safe, you have to share them the correct information so that they make the best choices for them. So one myth that we know that is going around is that people have experienced an overdose by being in the same room as fentanyl. We know that is not true. There's no science that supports that. Fentanyl must enter your body for it to affect you. So being near fentanyl or just touching fentanyl or giving someone CPR to someone experiencing an overdose will not cause you to overdose. Additionally, another myth is you can not reverse a fentanyl overdose with naloxone. That absolutely is not true. Fentanyl is an opioid, and as remember in that previous training, I showed you how naloxone works. It is going to work the same way, even if it's fentanyl. Naloxone can reverse fentanyl overdoses. Naloxone can temporarily stop the body from responding to opioids, which includes fentanyl. So we always give naloxone in response to an overdose, but it's just highlighting that multiple doses may be necessary. So I do want to pause to see if any questions came in before going into actually of how to utilize fentanyl test strips that can come in packs like this.
There are no questions in the Q&A right now.
Yes.
You had the other drugs that fentanyl has been found in. We've heard that it's also been found in cannabis on the street.
Yeah.
No,
No. So we have no confirmation of our cannabis supply in New York City having fentanyl in it. So it's really important for folks to also distinguish between what could look like cannabis, which is not cannabis, it's just K2. K2 is a synthetic cannabinoid, it's completely different. Essentially, it can be sprayed with chemicals and we don't know what those chemicals are. It can change from batch to batch. And folks can have bad reactions to K2. So again, if you see the signs of anything that may look like an opioid overdose, we still encourage folks to give naloxone. It's just that we have not seen cannabis in New York City supply that has fentanyl in it.
Interesting. Okay.
So when it comes to fentanyl test strips, this is what a test strip kind of looks like. We can put it in animation into PowerPoint. And it just tells people that it has the potential to tell people that their drugs contain fentanyl and prevent overdoses if used correctly with other risk reduction practices. So remember how I mentioned earlier before we got into this section, there are things that folks can do to lower their risk of an overdose. So in combination of using fentanyl test strips and those other risk reduction strategies and practices, it can potentially prevent an overdose. So there are benefits to fentanyl test strips. So they are highly sensitive. So they are pretty good at testing drug product when prepared for the presence of fentanyl. It is inexpensive. It costs about $1 a strip. And also it allows for discussion and education about harm reduction in most settings. So this can just be a really way to introduce a conversation about substance use, which can be really challenging for many folks. But it's also easy to carry. It's literally this small in regard to the packet that the test strips come in. And the tests are pretty rapid, and it can prevent overdose when used correctly, as mentioned before, and it is interpreted properly. But there are limitations to fentanyl test strips. So human error can occur. So it does require for you to prep the substance in a certain way, read the results, acknowledge with most things, human error can occur. So that is a limitation. False positives or negative or false negatives tests, that can happen with any kind of test. It does not provide information on the potency or strength or concentration of fentanyl. So even if it does come up positive, it just tells me that fentanyl is present. It doesn't tell me how strong. It doesn't tell me how much. So this is why we always encourage other precautions to be taken to lower risk. It cannot detect every fentanyl analog. So acknowledging that can be rapidly changing, and the fentanyl test strips may miss an analog there. So acknowledging that could be a limitation, and negative tests can cause a false sense of security. So just because a product doesn't have fentanyl in it doesn't mean that it's still possible to cause an overdose. So we really want folks to understand that overdose is still possible, even if fentanyl is not part of that person's drug products. And when it comes to fentanyl analogs, as I mentioned before, there are many analogs which are all similar in their chemical makeup of fentanyl. Some are stronger than fentanyl, but when fentanyl or any other analog binds to the brain opioid receptors, it causes respiratory depression or that slowed breathing, and that can result in an overdose. So fentanyl test strips, again, cannot tell the difference between analogs. So there's no way to tell the strength of fentanyl once it's been identified using the strips. So when I talked about human error, it's really important that people understand the steps of how to prepare their drug product. So we do want folks to measure 10 milligrams. So approximately 10 milligrams shows up as the hair on a penny of Abraham Lincoln's hair. So that's about 10 milligrams of a product. But also acknowledging, in addition to that, you do need to use about a teaspoon of water, of sterile water, mixed in with that 10 milligrams to make a solution that can be tested. So there are different options, because acknowledging, depending on what someone's product is, depending how it comes packaged or how it's consumed, there are options on how to test the drug most effectively. So if possible, we understand that everyone does not necessarily use this option or like this option, is to dissolve all of the drugs you plan to use in a container. But when it comes to, as mentioned before, when it's meth, MDA, or ecstasy, you need to use a teaspoon of water for every 10 milligrams. For all other drugs, it's a half a teaspoon, so that 5 milligrams of water for every 10 milligrams of crystal or powder, to test your drugs before to prepare your drug before testing. So you want to stir the drugs until it's fully dissolved. And after testing your drugs this way, you can drink them or snort them using a clean nasal spray device, or wait until the water evaporates, depending on how folks prefer to consume their substance. And this is the most accurate way to test someone's drug product. So again, they're using all of their products to test. Acknowledging in option one is the most accurate way, but when it comes to drugs or substances that come in pill form, this is also why we encourage people to crush them and use all the products to test, because fentanyl is not always mixed evenly into other drugs. So if fentanyl is in your drugs, it's what we say, it has a chocolate chip effect. As you see on the image, you can test one portion of the product and fentanyl may not be in there and it'll test negative. But a portion that you potentially did not test because it kind of clumped together could attain fentanyl. So this is why we encourage folks to test the whole product to get the most accurate reading. So with pills, that means you can crush them to do that. But there's option 2 because we know that option 1 does not work for everyone. But there's still ways to get some level of information to help in regards to risk reduction. We ask folks to test the residue that can maybe be in the plastic bag that the substance came in. So this is basically crush or put the crushed drugs in the small bag, and then empty the bag out. So there's just the residue that's left, that small amount in the bag, and test that following the same steps of how much water based on the type of drug being tested. So it is less accurate than the first option. However, it can still provide people with very helpful information. And the third option is to test a small amount of the drug. So mentioning that 10 milligrams of the drug, the amount of drugs that cover the hair of Abe Lincoln on a penny is about 10 milligrams. And then mixing it together. So finely crush pills and tablets, add water to the powder and mix thoroughly. If you do not want to test the entire pill, break the pill into half and test the portion from the middle. So again, the same 2 steps. And as with step 2 is less effective or less accurate than option 2 is less accurate than option 1. Option 3 is also less accurate than option 1 and option 2, but it's still a way that people can potentially gain access to information. So when it comes to the test strip itself, when you open the packet, you will see the strips, and you will take one out holding it at the top, which is at the end, which is that blue part at the top. And then you will place the strip in the solution you created using option 1, 2, or 3 to create that solution for 15 seconds. Once the 15 seconds is done, you just take it out and lay it on a flat surface for 2 to 5 minutes. So it's relatively quick to get results at 2 to 5 minute wait. So I'll take any questions about how to prepare the substance. That section I just went over before we go to how to interpret the actual results on the strip.
Eric,
I see 2 questions.
Yeah, we see 2 questions in the chat. Can you read them out for us, please?
Sure. One person said, thank you, very informative presentation. They were hoping that you would be able to share your email address in the chat.
Sure. So it's on the last slide, but I can tell you right now, or I can actually just put it into the chat as you see me type it.
Do you want to do the next question, Eric?
Yes, while I do that.
It may have been in context to a point that you were making earlier, maybe about 7 minutes ago or so, but it says, what about the young children at a daycare who were exposed to fentanyl?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I put the email into the chat for everyone to see. In regards to that is an unfortunate tragedy. I cannot explain a life lost there as anything else. It's just really important for folks to also understand that is a whole active situation in regards to investigation and the legal process that I have no insights into. We know that children learn in different ways. So acknowledging if you've ever been around anyone younger than the age of 2, how much they touch everything, put things into their hands into their mouth. And that could be a way that someone can consume opioids. It has to make it into their body in some way. But we know that just by someone touching fentanyl is not going to cause that for it to be absorbed through skin. We even know that, so it's really important for folks to understand. I can't speak to specifics of the cases because I also don't know the specifics of the case. But we know that is the mode of someone consuming opioids is not just by touching them. Folks do have to consume them. Ways that people do consume substances include inhalation, injection, and consuming them through eating them. But touch is not one of them. So I do appreciate that question though. So I'm not seeing any other questions. I'm gonna continue on just to understand how we interpret the results. So it is fentanyl test strips, I would say, when I learned how to use them, it's counterintuitive to most of the test results that we see. We would usually see For other items, 2 lines means positive, right? Not in fentanyl test strips. 1 line means positive. So a positive test will have 1 line in the test area. So if it tests positive, your drug contains fentanyl. It may not tell you the type or how strong or how much the fentanyl in that drug product is. So we encourage you to follow other safety tips that we talked about earlier if you're planning to use the drugs. Some people may decide to not use their drugs based on the test results. Additionally, when it's 2 lines in the test area, that means it is negative. So your test shows that fentanyl or fentanyl analogs have not been detected in your drugs. However, no test is 100% accurate. So your drugs may still contain fentanyl. So we still encourage folks to follow safety steps in regards to how they're using their drugs to lower their risk of an overdose. An overdose is still possible again, even if fentanyl is not present in someone's drugs. Factors that can lead to overdose include strength of your drugs, changes in your tolerance. So it's just really important for folks to know, even if it says the strip says that there's no fentanyl or analogs present, it's still really important to practice risk reduction. So use of, just showing you that a negative test will have 2 lines in the test area. So if the second line is very faint, as you may see in the image, in the photo, it should still be read as a negative result. But like anything, there's invalid tests that can show up when testing using fentanyl test strips. An invalid test will either have no lines or 1 line at the bottom of the test area. So if it's invalid, which is reverse your drugs using a new strip to retest your drugs, using a new strip to confirm whether your drugs contain fentanyl. And again, follow those same safety tips that we talked about earlier. So I can show brief parts of how to actually to test that, because it can be really hard to understand when you aren't seeing it visually at one time at the same time. So I'm just going to fast forward this a little bit to just showing where. There we go. So just play that part real quick.
Depending on the texture of the drugs that are being tested, you may need to prepare a sample before testing. Drugs that are already a fine powder don't require any preparation, since we need about 10 milligrams of a sample. Drugs that don't come in a fine powder, but instead come in a solid rock, crystal, or pill form, will first need to be crushed into a fine powder. Don't worry about measuring 10 milligrams. We'll do that together later in this video. You will need the drugs that will be consumed: a teaspoon, a small amount of clean water or a sterile water vial, a small clean container like a cooker or a ketchup cup, a small clean see-through plastic baggie, a fentanyl test strip, a watch, cell phone, or cooking timer, a microscope or penny for approximating measurement. Any type of pill can be tested, for example, ecstasy, or any pill obtained from a non-medical source. To prepare a pill for testing, place the entire pill or a part of the pill intended for consumption on a clean surface. Using the back of a metal spoon or another hard object, crush the substance into a fine powder. If you do not want to test the entire pill or tablet, break the pill in half and use a sharp object like scissors or a razor blade to scrape a sample from the center of the pill into a clean container for testing. To prepare crystal methamphetamine, MDMA, ketamine, or crack cocaine that often come in larger crystals or rocks, place a small amount of the drug onto a piece of paper or clean or new aluminum foil. Fold the paper or foil so the drug sample is contained inside, a bit like an envelope, and press the package with the back of a metal spoon or other hard object. This will avoid pieces of the drug scattering while you crush it. Now that we know how to prepare the drugs, we'll move on to testing them with a fentanyl test strip. There are 3 ways to test drugs for fentanyl using fentanyl test strips. We're going to demonstrate each of these methods and then discuss how to interpret the fentanyl test strip's results. Option 1, testing all the drugs that are going to be consumed. We're now going to measure out the quantity of drugs that are to be consumed in increments of 10 milligrams. If you have a microscope, 1 spoonful of powder is equal to 10 milligrams. If you don't have a microscope, you can use the tip of a key to scoop out the powder. For visual reference, 10 milligrams is enough of the drug to cover Abraham Lincoln's hair on a penny. Add your 10 milligrams of powder to a small, clean container. Continue to add additional scoops to the container depending on how much of the drug you'd like to consume right now. If you are testing MDMA or crystal meth, add 1 teaspoon or 5 milliliters of water per 10 milligrams of crystal or powder to the container. In other words, 1 teaspoon for each penny or microscoop of product. For all other drugs, instead add half a teaspoon or 2.5 milliliters of water per penny or microscoop to the container. Open the fentanyl test strip packet and remove the strip holding it at the top end. Place the wavy side down into the container with the dissolved drugs. Let the fentanyl test strip sit for 15 seconds in the water. Make sure that the strip does not get wet above the line you see at the top of the blue waves, as this could trigger an invalid test result. After the 15 seconds, remove the fentanyl test strip and place it on a flat surface for 2 minutes, and then check the results.
Option 2, testing the residue of drugs. Transfer the crushed drugs into the small, clean plastic bag and shake the bag for at least 15 seconds to mix. Set your drugs aside in another receptacle. Some residue of the powder will remain in the bag. Add water to the clear plastic bag. It's important to note for meth, MDMA, and ecstasy, add 1 teaspoon of water. And for all other drugs, use half a teaspoon. Take out 1 fentanyl test strip and place the wavy side down into the baggie containing the drug residue dissolved in water. Let the strip absorb the water for 15 seconds.
After the 15 seconds, remove the fentanyl test strip and place it on a flat surface for 2 minutes, and then check the results. Option 3, testing a small amount. We're now going to measure out 10 milligrams of powder for testing purposes. As with the first method, you can use a microscope or a key to measure out 10 milligrams. For visual reference, that's enough to cover Abraham Lincoln's hair on a penny. Add your powder to a small container. We're now going to add water to the container. It's important to note here that with meth, MDMA, and ecstasy, you add 1 teaspoon or 5 milliliters of water. And for all other drugs, use half a teaspoon or 2.5 milliliters. Take out 1 fentanyl test strip and place the wavy end into the container that has the drug dissolved in water. Let the strip absorb the water for 15 seconds. After the 15 seconds, remove the fentanyl test strip and place it on a flat surface for 2 minutes. Interpreting results. This is an example of a positive test. This means that fentanyl or a fentanyl analog that the strip is capable of detecting has been detected, although we don't know exactly which kind of fentanyl or how much there is. This is an example of a negative test. This means that fentanyl or one of the analogs the strips can detect has not been detected. Please remember, no test is 100% accurate. The drugs may still contain a different kind of fentanyl or a similar synthetic opioid. Regardless of what the fentanyl test strip results are, everyone should follow overdose safety precautions. The third result could be an invalid test. If you see an invalid test result, please retest the drugs with a new fentanyl test strip. Without testing them again, there is no way of knowing if the drugs have fentanyl in them. Please note, the results for these test strips are the opposite of many common at-home tests, like a rapid COVID-19 test or a pregnancy test.
Reduce your risk of overdose.
So just so that you had a visual way to see how to test the substances and interpret results. So I'll take any final questions that folks may have. And both videos I showed today are available on YouTube in multiple languages. So if you have any questions about naloxone, that is our email address for naloxone@health.nyc.gov. If you have any questions or feedback about fentanyl test strips, that email address is rar@health.nyc.gov. So I want to thank everyone.
Thank you. Alrighty, guys, unless there's any other questions, I just want to say thank you again. to NYC DOHMH, Shaquasia, and everybody here taking on this information. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but so important. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we'll see you soon. Okay, thank